Rachel Monroe stepped into the courthouse hearing with her twins pressed to her hips, and the room turned like a blade. Grant Wexler didn't stand beside her. He stood beside Sienna Blake, smiling as if Rachel were a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. "Tell the judge how you got those kids," Sienna said loudly, her voice sweet and cruel. Rachel's wedding ring felt too loose on her finger, like it might slide off and disappear. She tried to speak, but the bailiff was already guiding her toward the front, eyes on the clock, not her shaking hands. Her iPhone buzzed with a notification she couldn't open fast enough. An email preview stamped 8:12 a.m. DNA report attached. Judge Hale flipped open a sealed folder and didn't look up when she said, "This court has the official results." Sienna's smile snapped, fast and ugly. And in the back row, someone clutched a printed security camera still from the courthouse hallway, proof of who handed Sienna the file. Rachel Monroe was 42, a pediatric nurse who could start an IV with one hand while holding a crying toddler with the other. At 5:10 a.m., she slipped out of her Queens apartment in worn sneakers, leaving Eli and Emma asleep on the pull-out couch, their backpacks lined up like little soldiers by the door. She kissed their foreheads and tucked the same family photo into her scrub pocket. 3 smiling faces in Central Park, taken before Grant Wexler learned to weaponize silence. At the hospital, Rachel moved through fluorescent hallways with quiet purpose. She refilled juice cups, smoothed blankets, and stayed an extra 10 minutes to show an anxious grandmother how to check a pulse. When her break came, she didn't eat. She poured hot water over the last cheap oatmeal packet and saved her cash for the twins' daycare deposit, the one Grant had promised to cover and then forgot. A small Starbucks coffee sat untouched on the counter until the resident shoved it toward her. "Drink," he said. "You're running on fumes." Her phone, an older iPhone with a cracked corner, buzzed all morning. Unknown number, then another. Rachel couldn't pick up with parents watching, so she let it vibrate against her hip like a warning. After shift, she drove to her father's rehab center, signed medication forms, and argued with billing about a charge that didn't belong to her. On the way out, she checked the mailbox at home and found an envelope stamped "Final Notice." The amount made her stomach drop. She sat on the stairwell, counted the bills. Con Ed, the twins' pediatric copay, her father's ambulance fee. Grant's name still sat on the accounts, but the payments were bouncing back to her. She texted him one line. "Please confirm you'll be at the hearing." 3 dots appeared, then vanished. No answer. Rachel folded the paper small enough to hide, because she refused to let the kids see her panic. Still, she kept her voice soft when Eli asked why Mommy's hands were shaking. "Too much coffee," she lied, and lifted him higher so he wouldn't see her eyes. By late afternoon, the sky over Manhattan turned the color of steel. Rachel opened her laptop to print court documents, but the page wouldn't load. A calendar alert popped up instead, moved by someone else. Hearing time changed, and as the subway doors closed, in her banking app flashed "Account frozen," followed by a new message. CPS requested a home visit. Rachel kept the twins' birth certificates in a manila folder that never left her tote. Alongside them sat her father's rehab invoices, creased and coffee-stained, and a yellow sticky note with one sentence Grant had texted months ago. "If you want peace, sign what my lawyer sends." Her dad, Frank Monroe, had been a city bus driver for 30 years. A stroke last winter took his speech and most of his savings in the same month. Rachel paid for the gap between Medicare and reality. Therapy sessions, walkers, the ambulance ride that arrived like a siren and left like a mortgage. Every time she signed another form at the front desk, she pictured the twins' faces and swallowed the shame of asking the billing clerk for one more extension. Grant knew all of it. He used to show up with takeout and promises. Then he learned he could win without raising his voice. He canceled the daycare autopay the week before the hearing. He reported her debit card lost, so the replacement went to his Park Avenue office. When Rachel asked for access, he replied, "Calm down, you're emotional. We'll handle this later." Later never came. What trapped her wasn't love. It was paper. A temporary support agreement Grant had pushed in front of her after the separation. 3 pages, no lawyer on her side, and one brutal line. Rachel would not disparage Grant or discuss finances with anyone. If she violated it, he could argue she was unstable and retaliatory. She signed because Eli had a fever that night and the pharmacy wouldn't take her declined card. Now, with her account frozen and CPS at the door, she felt the walls closing. If she missed one shift, she risked her job. If she lost her job, she lost insurance. If she lost insurance, her father's rehab stopped. If her father declined, she'd blame herself forever. She stared at the worn paperback of meditations she kept for subway rides and realized she was no longer reading for wisdom. She was reading to stay upright. At 9:17 p.m., her phone lit up with a message from Grant's attorney. Stipulation attached. Sign tonight or we seek emergency custody. And when Rachel opened the attachment, she saw her own signature already pasted onto the last page. Lower Manhattan looked polished from the outside, but inside the courthouse everything felt fluorescent and sharp, like a place built to measure your worth in paperwork. Rachel Monroe stepped off the elevator with Eli on her left hip, and Emma's small hand locked around her finger. The twins' sneakers squeaked on the tile. A bailiff glanced at them, then at Rachel's wrinkled scrub jacket, and motioned her toward the benches without a word. Across the hallway, Grant Wexler's attorney sat at a narrow table, a MacBook open, a neat stack of exhibits clipped with color tabs. Grant himself stood near the courtroom doors, tailored coat, calm posture, as if this were a quarterly meeting. Beside him, Sienna Blake leaned in close, whispering into his ear, smiling for the people who mattered. When she noticed Rachel, her smile widened. Too bright, too practiced. Digital docket screen blinked. Wexler versus Monroe. Hearing, 9 a.m. Rachel's phone showed 8:58. She wanted to run after the daycare sitter who'd canceled, to beg a neighbor to rewind time, but the hallway was packed. Lawyers, clerks, 2 of Grant's relatives, and strangers waiting for their own disasters. There was no private place to breathe, no quiet corner to cry. A clerk called, "Parties, step forward," and Rachel felt every head turn. Emma's eyes lifted to the high ceiling, then to the security camera above the exit sign, its red light steady. Eli pressed his cheek against Rachel's shoulder, whispering, "Mom, are we in trouble?" The courtroom door opened. Inside, the microphones on counsel table looked like tiny black mouths. On the judge's bench sat a sealed folder stamped in bold letters. Rachel caught Sienna's gaze flick to it and flick away fast like she'd been burned. Judge Marjorie Hale entered, robes swaying, face unreadable. She sat, scanned the room, then said, "Before we begin, the court will address the sealed submission." Sienna's hand shot out and gripped Grant's sleeve. Rachel didn't know the woman's name, only her visitor badge, and the way her eyes tracked Sienna, not Grant, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. In the last row, the gray-haired woman quietly lifted a printed still from the courthouse hallway camera and slid it toward Rachel's side of the aisle. Grant Wexler had learned how to win without raising his voice. In the hallway, he looked like the kind of man people trusted by default. Steady hands, clean cuffs, calm smile. He didn't glance at Eli and Emma for more than a second, not because he didn't recognize them, but because recognition would make him human, and today he needed to be untouchable. Rachel remembered a different Grant, the one who carried diaper bags in one hand and coffee in the other, who promised, "I'll take care of you." That promise had quietly turned into a leash. The first time he tightened it was small, moving her paycheck into one account for simplicity. Then he helped by putting bills under his name. Then, when she asked for access, he'd tilt his head and say, "Why are you making this dramatic?" By the time she realized she was trapped, her life was a row of passwords she didn't know. Now his control had a schedule. 2 weeks before the hearing, daycare suddenly lost her payment. The next week, her debit card stopped working. A week later, an email came from a credit bureau about a new account she'd never opened. Grant didn't need to threaten her directly. He just moved the ground under her feet and watched her stumble. He had reasons that sounded respectable if you didn't look too closely. A promotion at the fund, a new institutional investor who required stability, a board seat that would vanish if his divorce turned messy. In his world, a wife wasn't a partner. She was part of the brand, and Rachel, tired, broke, showing up with twins, didn't fit the picture he wanted framed on Park Avenue. Sienna hovered close, whispering updates like a stage manager. Grant's attorney typed fast on a laptop, arranging exhibits as if they were slides in a pitch deck. Grant uncapped a Mont Blanc pen and signed a document without reading it, because he'd already decided the outcome. Yet when Rachel shifted on the bench, he finally looked at her and spoke softly enough that only she could hear. "Don't embarrass yourself," he said. "Just agree, and I'll be generous." Rachel's throat tightened. Generous with what? My own life? Grant's mouth didn't move into a smile, but his eyes did. With your children's future? He nodded once toward his attorney, an invisible cue, practiced, effortless. A folder labeled paternity slid onto the counsel table, and Sienna's hand rose as if she'd been waiting to swear Rachel in as a liar. Sienna Blake rose before Rachel could even find her voice. She looked like she belonged at the polished counsel table. Smooth hair, calm posture, a visitor badge clipped perfectly to her blazer as if it were a medal. She didn't introduce herself as Grant's girlfriend. She introduced herself as a concerned family friend. The kind of phrase that sounded harmless until it landed like a stone. "Your Honor," Sienna said, turning slightly so the room could see her profile. "I've been the one helping Mr. Wexler keep the children's routine stable when Mrs. Monroe can't." Rachel's cheeks burned. The twins were right there. They were listening. She wanted to pull them under her coat and hide them from every eye in the courtroom. But the bailiff stood between the benches and the aisle, directing people like pieces on a board. Rachel was trapped in the very thing Grant had planned, a public room where composure mattered more than pain. Sienna opened an iPad and tapped once, twice like she was running a presentation. "We have documentation," she said. "Missed pickups, unpaid balances, erratic messaging." She didn't say daycare. She didn't say frozen account. She didn't say the card that stopped working because Grant had cut it off. She let the silence fill in the worst story. Grant didn't look at Rachel. He watched the judge, waiting for the right moment to nod. Sienna stepped closer to the microphone. "And now she arrives with the twins to a hearing," she added, voice rising just enough for the back row. "As if children are props. It's heartbreaking." Rachel's fingers tightened around her worn wedding ring. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. If she snapped, she'd become the unstable woman in their script. If she cried, she'd be called manipulative. That was when Emma lifted her small chin and pointed, straight at Sienna's badge. "You're the lady from Daddy's yellow light apartment," Emma said, clear as a bell. You told us to call you Mommy Sienna when Mommy wasn't there." The courtroom rustled. Grant's attorney froze mid-page. Sienna's face flickered, one sharp crack in her practiced smile. Eli leaned forward, eager to help, not understanding danger. "And you handed Daddy a white envelope in the hallway," he added. "I saw the camera blink." Sienna's hand jerked, knocking her iPad against the table. Judge Hale's eyes narrowed. "Clerk, pull the courthouse hallway camera from 8:12 a.m. Right now." The moment Judge Hale ordered the hallway footage, Grant's attorney didn't argue with his mouth. He argued with paper. He stood, lifted a binder, and spoke in the calm, polished tone of someone who believed volume was beneath him. "Your Honor, the issue is not a child's imagination," he said, flipping to a tab marked Stability. "The issue is Ms. Monroe's pattern." Rachel felt the courtroom turn toward her again, like a cold draft. She could hear the soft scrape of chairs, the whisper of Grant's relatives in the second row. Her wedding ring suddenly felt heavy, like it had absorbed every lie and kept it. The attorney slid a printed daycare ledger onto the screen. Late fees, missed pickups, a note that said, "Mother unreachable." Rachel's stomach dropped because she knew exactly what it would look like, without the missing pieces Grant had hidden. Miss Monroe arrives today with 2 small children, the attorney continued, demonstrating poor judgment and an inability to separate adult conflict from parenting. Sienna's face had regained a thin, satisfied line, the way people look when they think they've regained control. Grant sat still, hands folded, eyes on the judge as if Rachel were simply a line item. Rachel tried to speak, but Judge Hale raised a hand. "One at a time," she said, not unkind, just strict. "Counsel will finish." That was the trap. Rachel couldn't interrupt. She couldn't snatch the paper and point to the date Grant canceled the autopay. She couldn't explain how her phone went dead because her account was frozen. In this room, emotion was a weapon, one Grant had already aimed at her. The attorney turned one more page and delivered his cruelest line like it was evidence. "Ms. Monroe wants sympathy," he said, loud enough for the back row. "But sympathy doesn't raise children. Structure does?" Eli pressed closer to Rachel's side, sensing the tension. Emma stared at the judge, blinking hard as if holding tears on command. Rachel's throat burned, but she stayed silent. Because one outburst would feed their script. Judge Hale leaned forward. Her gaze moved from the daycare ledger to the paternity folder on the table. "Counsel," she said, voice cutting clean through the room. "I want the original file, not a printout. I want the chain of custody. And I want to know who delivered it to the court this morning." Sienna's fingers twitched against her iPad like she was trying to erase something. Owen Carlyle quietly stood and said, "Your Honor, the document's timestamp doesn't match the court's upload log, and I can prove it." Owen Carlyle didn't sound dramatic when he spoke. That was what made the room listen. He walked to the lectern with a thin laptop under his arm and a single sheet of paper. No speeches, no anger, just numbers and logs. "Your Honor," he said, "the document labeled paternity was not uploaded through the court's portal. The court system shows no matching file hash, no matching case ID, and no matching timestamp." Grant's attorney opened his mouth, but Judge Hale lifted one finger. "Let him finish." Rachel's heart hammered so hard she felt it in her teeth. She wanted to grab the twins and run, or cry, or shout that she'd been telling the truth all along. But the bailiff was still there, the benches were still full, and every move she made could be turned into unstable behavior. So she stayed still, holding Eli's knee with one hand and Emma's fingers with the other, like anchors in a storm. Owen placed the paper on the evidence table. "This is the court's upload log," he continued. "At 8:12 a.m., a file was received under this case number. But the file name and metadata do not match the exhibit counsel presented. The court's file was encrypted and sealed immediately. What counsel handed over appears to be a separate document created afterward." Sienna's breath hitched. She pressed her thumb to the edge of her iPad as if she could push the moment back. Judge Hale leaned forward. "Created afterward," she repeated. "By whom?" Owen didn't guess. "I can't assign a person without a subpoena, Your Honor, but the document properties show a device label and user profile. If the court orders it, I can compare that to the device records." Grant's attorney shifted. Too quick, too smooth. "This is getting into technicalities." "These are not technicalities," Judge Hale said, voice flat. "These are facts." Rachel's cracked iPhone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't look. She didn't dare. Till she could only stare at the sealed folder on the bench, the one Judge Hale had mentioned before the hearing even began. The one Sienna couldn't stop looking at. Judge Hale turned to the clerk. "Pull the hallway camera from 8:12. Pull the portal log, and bring me the sealed submission." Sienna's composure broke for half a second, just long enough for everyone to see fear. In the back row, the gray-haired woman raised her hand and whispered, "Judge, I can tell you who printed that fake report." The courtroom took on a different temperature when the gray-haired woman spoke. She wasn't loud, but her voice carried because it didn't shake. "Your Honor, I can tell you who printed that report," she said. Grant's head snapped toward her so fast Rachel felt it like a gust. For the first time that morning, his calm looked strained, like a mask pulled too tight. Sienna's fingers curled around her iPad until her knuckles went pale. Judge Hale studied the woman. Name and relation to the case. Beverly Wexler, she answered, swallowing once. I'm Mr. Wexler's mother. A murmur rolled through the benches. Rachel's stomach clenched. If Grant's own mother was speaking, it meant something was breaking, but it also meant Grant would punish whoever stood in his way. Rachel's mind flashed to the CPS message, to HR waiting with a file, to the landlord's final notice tucked in her tote. She felt surrounded by systems she couldn't control. The bailiff leaned down toward Rachel. Ma'am, children can't remain in the aisle. If they become disruptive, they'll have to be removed. They're not disruptive, Rachel whispered, tightening her hold on Emma's hand. Eli pressed into her side, sensing danger without understanding it. Grant's attorney seized the moment. Your Honor, this is exactly our concern, he said smoothly. Ms. Monroe is unable to manage basic boundaries. We ask for immediate temporary custody, today, pending verification of these issues. Rachel's heart lurched. Temporary custody today meant she could walk out of this room without her children. She tried to stand, but Judge Hale's gaze pinned her in place. Ms. Monroe, the judge said, you will speak when I ask you. Counsel will not provoke a spectacle. Rachel's mouth went dry. She couldn't interrupt. She couldn't plead. She couldn't even lift her phone to show the alerts without being accused of theatrics. The trap was perfect. A public room, a strict judge, a bailiff watching the twins, and a man who knew how to look reasonable while he cut her legs out. Grant finally leaned toward her, voice low and practiced. Sign the stipulation, he murmured, sliding a paper across the table with his pen. You leave with them, refuse, and you don't. Rachel stared at the line for her signature. Her own name looked like a surrender. Judge Hale turned back to Beverly. Mrs. Wexler, if you're going to make an accusation, you will be specific. Beverly's hands trembled as she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded sheet. Fresh printer ink, a corner smudged like someone grabbed it in a hurry. The clerk returned from the security office and said, Judge Hale, hallway footage from 8:12 a.m. is ready, and it shows Miss Blake handing Mr. Wexler an envelope. The clerk dimmed the monitor. Iron in the courthouse hallway filled the courtroom screen. Cold tile, an exit sign, the red blink of the security camera. Rachel saw herself in the footage for a split second, juggling Eli and Emma at the metal detector, her wedding ring flashing once as she adjusted Emma's hoodie. Then Sienna appeared, brisk and polished, holding a white envelope like it weighed nothing. She handed it to Grant at 8:12 a.m. Grant glanced up at the camera, then tucked the envelope inside his coat with the same casual ease he used when signing checks. The room rustled. Someone in the second row inhaled sharply. Rachel's face burned anyway, because the humiliation had already been served, and the crowd had already tasted it. Grant's attorney tried to stand, but Judge Hale didn't even look at him. Sit down, she said, flat as stone. Grant finally spoke, even louder than he needed to, as if volume could turn a lie into law. Those kids aren't mine, he said, pointing at Rachel like she'd dragged strangers into his life. She's been scamming me for years. Eli stiffened. Emma's fingers tightened around Rachel's. Rachel couldn't react. Not with the bailiff watching the twins, not with Grant's relatives staring, not with a court reporter typing every syllable. If she cried, she'd be unstable. If she yelled, she'd be aggressive. Grant had built the trap and locked the door. Judge Hale reached for the sealed folder and broke it open with a clean, practiced motion. Papers slid out. Official letterhead, a barcode, a case number. She scanned one page, then another, her expression unchanged. This court has the official paternity results ordered through an approved lab, she said. They were filed through our portal and sealed upon receipt. Grant's jaw tightened. Sienna's face went pale so fast it looked unreal. Judge Hale lifted her eyes. Mr. Wexler, the results confirm you are the father of both children. The document your counsel presented does not match this court's file. A sound escaped Sienna, half laugh, half choke. She stood abruptly, chair scraping, and snapped, "It wasn't supposed to be open today." Every head turned. Even Grant's mother covered her mouth. Judge Hale's voice sharpened. "Miss Blake, you will remain seated. Mr. Carlyle, prepare a preservation order for all devices and communications related to this submission." Sienna's composure shattered into panic, her gaze darting toward her iPad like it might save her. And then Beverly Wexler rose, holding a voicemail transcript, and said, "Yeah, Judge, my son admitted the secret himself." The courtroom didn't celebrate Rachel's vindication. It judged her anyway, quietly the way crowds do when they've already chosen a story and don't want to admit they were wrong. Grant's relatives leaned toward each other, whispering behind polite hands. One woman stared at Rachel's scuffed shoes like they were proof of failure. A man in the back shook his head as if Rachel had still caused all this by showing up. Rachel kept her eyes on Eli and Emma, not on the faces. Eli's small shoulders were rigid, trying to be brave the way he'd seen grown-ups do. Emma blinked hard, then whispered, "Mommy, are we going home?" Rachel nodded even though her throat felt locked. She couldn't let the kids see her shaking, not now. Not in this room where every tear could be turned into a weapon. And Sienna sat stiff, lips parted, eyes glassy with panic. Her hands kept moving, straightening her blazer, tapping her iPad, twisting the edge of her badge. Like a person trying to erase a moment that already happened. Grant didn't look at her. He looked at the judge, then at the court reporter, then at the clock, as if he could outlast the truth by staying calm. Judge Hale's gavel didn't slam. It clicked once, a warning more than a sound. "Order," she said. "This court will not tolerate theatrics." That was the second humiliation. Rachel had been accused out loud, but her relief had to stay silent. She wanted to tell them about the frozen bank account, the daycare payment that vanished, the CPS notice timed like a trap. But she also knew what Trish Keegan would say if she were here. Facts first, emotions later. Now the bailiff approached and lowered his voice. "Ma'am, keep the children seated, no talking." Rachel nodded quickly, pressing a finger to her lips for the twins. Eli obeyed. Emma's gaze stayed fixed on Grant like she was waiting for him to remember he was her father. When Rachel reached into her tote for tissues, her stomach dropped. The manila folder, birth certificates, rehab invoices, her proof was gone. She checked again. Faster. Nothing. Her hands went cold. Across the aisle, Sienna's iPad screen lit up with a notification banner she didn't notice. Print job complete. 8:07 a.m. The clerk took Beverly Wexler's transcript, pressed play, and Grant's voice filled the room. "Don't let the judge open the sealed file." Sienna handled it. Rachel didn't remember walking out of the courtroom, only that the air in the hallway felt thinner, like the building had sucked the oxygen out and left her with paperwork to breathe instead. She slipped into the nearest women's restroom and locked herself into the last stall, lowering Eli and Emma onto the closed lid so they wouldn't touch the floor. Their faces were quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence children wear when they're trying not to make things worse. Rachel pressed her forehead to the metal partition. The voicemail had played. The judge had heard it. The secret had cracked the room wide open, and still Rachel felt like the guilty one because she'd been accused first, out loud, in public. Her hands shook as she checked her tote again. One more time, then another. No manila folder, no birth certificates, no rehab invoices. The proof she'd guarded like a lifeline was simply gone. She swallowed a sob so hard it hurt, and if she fell apart, the twins would remember this bathroom forever. Emma tugged her sleeve. "Mommy, are you mad at us?" Rachel forced her voice steady. "Never, not for 1 second." She brushed Emma's hair back, then wiped Eli's cheek with the corner of a tissue, even though there was nothing there. It was the only thing she could control. Small hands, small faces, small normal gestures in a world that wanted to label her a disaster. Her cracked iPhone buzzed again. Account frozen. The same words, the same cold message. She stared at it until the letters blurred, then turned the screen face down on her knee. On the sink counter outside the stall, someone had abandoned a half-finished Starbucks coffee, the cardboard sleeve damp. Rachel caught herself envying the cup. At least it had been held. She pulled her wedding ring off and held it in her palm. The circle looked innocent. Everything else felt like a trap. Grant had planned for her to panic. He had planned for her to raise her voice. He had planned for the bailiff to remove the children if they cried. Rachel took one slow breath, then another, and whispered the only sentence that didn't feel like begging anymore. "I'm done begging." She slid the ring back on, squared her shoulders, and opened the stall door. The twins stood close, one on each side, like they were forming their own little wall around her. Then her phone lit up with a call. Unknown number, and the voicemail icon showed a new attachment. A woman's calm voice said, "Rachel Monroe? This is Trish Keegan. Your husband's mistress left a print log trail, and I have the courthouse record to prove it." Rachel didn't get a victory lap. She got a staircase of consequences waiting outside the stall door. When she stepped back into the hallway with Eli and Emma, a court officer stopped her and held out a slip. "Ms. Monroe, you've been served," he said, like he was handing her a parking ticket. The header made her vision blur. Emergency motion for temporary custody. Grant wasn't satisfied with being caught. He was trying to punish her for surviving. Her phone buzzed again. The landlord. Notice to pay or quit. 3 days. She stared at the date and felt her knees soften. Then a hospital number flashed. HR Rachel answered with the calm voice she used on parents in the ER. "Rachel," the HR manager said, careful and cold, "we received a complaint alleging you brought personal conflict onto hospital property and created a safety concern. Effective immediately, you're placed on administrative leave pending review." Rachel's mouth opened. No words came. Administrative leave meant no shifts. No shifts meant no insurance. No insurance meant her father's rehab would stop. She drove straight from the courthouse to the rehab center because she couldn't sit still with fear. The receptionist looked apologetic before she even spoke. "Ms. Monroe, the account is past due. If we don't receive a payment plan by Friday, we have to discuss discharge placement." Rachel pictured her father in a cheaper facility, losing therapy days because she couldn't hold everything up alone. She signed another form with a pen that shook in her hand. She walked into his room, and I kissed his forehead and forced a smile he didn't have the strength to return. Back in Queens, a CPS worker was waiting in the lobby by the mailboxes. Professional, neutral, a clipboard. Rachel's stomach turned to ice. "We received a report," the worker said. "We need to verify the children's living situation and caregiving plan." Rachel wanted to scream that the timing was a weapon, that Grant was pulling levers. Instead, she nodded and opened her apartment door. She showed the clean beds, the food in the fridge, the twins' school forms. Emma stood straight like a tiny soldier. Eli pointed at the family photo on the wall and said, "That's us when Daddy was nice." The CPS worker's eyes flickered. Sympathy, then restraint. "I'll need documentation," she said. Rachel's chest tightened. The manila folder was still missing. That night, Rachel sat on the edge of the pull-out couch with her cracked iPhone in both hands, scrolling through frozen accounts and unanswered messages, feeling the loneliness settle like dust. Then Trish Keegan's number flashed again. "I know you're drowning," Trish said. "But listen, Sienna didn't just print a fake report. She stole your folder and courthouse security logged it." "Meet me at 7 a.m. tomorrow," Trish added, "because the person who took your folder is on camera, and Judge Hale will see it." Rachel met Trish Keegan at 7 a.m. in a narrow cafe across from the courthouse, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a tired espresso machine that still did its job. Trish was in her 60s, silver hair pulled back, no-nonsense coat, the calm of someone who'd watched lies collapse under their own weight. She didn't waste time on sympathy. First, Trish said, sliding a paper across the table. We keep you standing. CPS, HR, housing. Those are pressure points. We answer them with documentation and court orders. Rachel's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. It was a courthouse incident log with a timestamp. 8:15 a.m., property removed from bench area. Security note. Beneath it was a printed still from the hallway camera. Sienna Blake, angled just right, slipping Rachel's manila folder into a tote while Grant's attorney blocked the view with his binder. Rachel's throat tightened. That's my dad's invoices, my kids' birth certificates. I know, Trish said, voice firm. Courthouse security has a chain of custody record for the footage. It's admissible. And it explains why you looked unprepared when CPS asked for paperwork. That wasn't an accident. Rachel stared at the still until her eyes burned. The humiliation in the courtroom, the missing folder, the way the landlord's notice and HR call hit the same day. Suddenly it lined up like dominoes. Trish opened an iPad and showed a second document, a print log from a courthouse public terminal. The job name read DNA_report_final.pdf, printed at 8:07 a.m. The user account was tied to a visitor badge scan. Not your name, Trish said. Hers. Rachel swallowed. So what now? Now we move like adults, Trish replied. I filed my appearance at 6:42. I'm requesting an emergency order, no retaliation through HR, no harassment through CPS, and no custody change based on fabricated exhibits. We're also asking for a preservation order on every device involved. Grants, Sienna's, and Counsel's. Rachel's phone buzzed with another landlord text, but for the first time, she didn't feel like collapsing. Trish leaned in, eyes steady. Listen to me, she said. You are not on trial for being poor. They are on trial for tampering with evidence. Outside, the courthouse doors swung open and people streamed in, coats damp from winter mist. Trish gathered the papers into a neat stack and handed them to Rachel like a shield. As they entered the courtroom, the bailiff announced, Judge Hale has ordered Ms. Blake's devices produced immediately. And Sienna's face drained white. Inside Judge Hale's courtroom, the air felt different. Less like a stage and more like a lab. Trish Keegan stood with her files stacked clean and tight, while Owen Carlisle placed 2 clear evidence bags on the clerk's table. Sienna Blake's iPad and phone, each sealed with a red tamper strip and a handwritten time. Chain of custody begins at 9:14 a.m., the clerk said, reading from the log. Received from courthouse security. Stored in locker C3. Sienna sat rigid, hands clasped so hard her knuckles shone. Grant's jaw worked once, then stopped, like he was forcing his face back into calm. Owen didn't accuse anyone. He simply opened his laptop and mirrored a screen to the court monitor. Your Honor, he said, this is the courthouse print server record. At 8:07 a.m., DNA_report_final.pdf was printed from Terminal 4. The badge used to activate that terminal belongs to Miss Blake's visitor pass. The file was created at 8:05 a.m. Like on a device labeled SB-PR-a laptop. Grant's attorney stood quickly. Objection. Sit, Judge Hale said, not raising her voice. Rachel's hands were cold, but Trish had placed Eli and Emma with a court officer at the side bench, coloring quietly. The twins were safe, watched, and out of the line of fire, exactly where Rachel had begged the system to keep them. Owen clicked again. A document properties window appeared, then an email header. This is not content, he explained. This is metadata, timestamps, device labels, and routing. It cannot be faked without leaving more marks. He highlighted a string of messages between Sienna and an unknown address. Subject line, sealed file, do not let her see it. Sienna's lips parted. That's not... Judge Hale held up a hand. Ms. Blake, you will not speak unless asked. Trish stepped forward. Your Honor, the court has now confirmed 3 things. Ms. Blake printed the fake report at 8:07, delivered it at 8:12, and removed Ms. Monroe's folder at 8:15. That isn't messy divorce behavior. That is evidence tampering. Grant finally leaned toward his attorney, whispering fast. Rachel saw it, the shift from confidence to calculation. Owen's voice stayed steady. There's more, he said. A draft trust document saved on Ms. Blake's device. It lists the twins' names, Eli and Emma, and names Ms. Blake as administrative manager. Rachel's wedding ring felt like a weight again, but this time it grounded her. Judge Hale looked directly at Grant and said, Mr. Wexler, the court is issuing subpoenas for your Park Avenue financial records today, and if you move $1, you will answer to me. Judge Hale didn't raise her voice when she exposed the secret. She didn't have to. The courtroom screen already did it for her. Clean lines of text, dates, routing numbers, and names that shouldn't have been together. Mr. Wexler, she said, you claimed you needed emergency custody because Mrs. Monroe is unstable. Yet your own actions show a coordinated effort to sabotage her documentation and introduce a fake exhibit. Grant started to speak, but Trish Keegan stepped forward. Your Honor, the secret isn't just the fake paternity report, she said. It's why they needed it. Owen Carlyle clicked to a folder recovered from Sienna's device. A draft document appeared. Wexler Children's Trust. Eli Wexler, Emma Wexler. Administrative Manager, Blake Strategic, LLC. Beneath it, a spreadsheet tab labeled Transfers listed dates that matched Grant's bonus cycle. Another click revealed an email thread with the subject line, Before disclosure, move it. Rachel felt her stomach drop. The twins' names weren't being protected. They were being used. Judge Hale's eyes lifted. Ms. Blake, you are listed as the administrative manager. Explain to the court why you, an unrelated third party, had signing authority tied to these children's funds. Sienna's face tightened, then cracked. I didn't. Grant told me it was legal, she blurted too fast. She caught herself, but it was already out. She turned toward Grant, voice sharpening. You said it was for the kids. You said we'd be a family after this. Grant's jaw flexed. He didn't deny it. He simply stared forward like a man waiting for his lawyer to fix it. And that's when Sienna lost control completely. He promised me, she snapped, loud enough for the court reporter to pause. He said if Rachel signed, the trust would shield the money and no one would ask questions. The words hung in the air. Shield, money, no questions. Ugly and unmistakable. Rachel's hands shook, but Trish leaned in and spoke low. Steady meant only for her. You're not powerless, she said. They built a story. We have the timeline. Judge Hale's gavel clicked once. This court is issuing an immediate restraint order on any trust assets connected to these children, she said, and I am referring the tampering evidence to the appropriate authorities. Grant finally looked at Rachel. Just once. Not remorse. Calculation. As the bailiff moved towards Sienna, Judge Hale added, Tomorrow morning, the court will hear from the bank's compliance officer, and your Park Avenue payroll records will be on this bench. Rachel left the courthouse with Eli and Emma bundled close, the winter wind biting at their cheeks, but something inside her had stopped collapsing. The truth hadn't magically fixed her life. Her bank account was still frozen, her father's rehab still threatened, and HR still had her on leave. But for the first time in months, Rachel could see the shape of the trap, and that meant it could be escaped. That evening in Queens, she fed the twins macaroni from a pot and made it feel like dinner, not survival. When they finally fell asleep, she sat at the small kitchen table with Trish Keegan's stack of papers and Owen Carlyle's printed logs. The evidence didn't read like revenge. It read like reality. Timestamps, badge scans, my print jobs, and a trust draft that used her children's names like a shield. Trish's voice was firm on speakerphone. No more reacting, she said. We move first. Rachel did the unglamorous work that actually saves people. She called the credit bureaus and froze her credit. She filed a fraud alert on the account she never opened. She opened a new checking account at a local credit union with the little cash she had left, just to make sure diapers and groceries couldn't be controlled by Grant's passwords. She printed her work schedule and asked the charge nurse for a written statement about her performance. She emailed HR, short, calm, professional, requesting the complaint details in writing and copying Trish. No pleading, no explaining in circles, just facts. When her phone rang and Grant's name flashed, Rachel didn't answer at first. And she stared at it, feeling the old fear try to climb back into her throat. Then she remembered Judge Hale's face when she said, "This is not a technicality. This is fact." Rachel hit record and picked up. Grant's voice was soft, almost kind. "Rachel, you're tired. Sign the stipulation tonight and I'll make the CPS thing disappear. I'll even talk to your hospital. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Rachel kept her voice steady. "Put it in writing," she said, "and stop using our children as leverage." A pause. The kindness dropped. "You don't get to demand anything," he hissed. "You're replaceable." Rachel ended the call with one clean tap and saved the file, her hands still shaking, but not from helplessness. She looked at the twins sleeping, their small chests rising and falling, and then whispered the boundary like a vow. No more begging, only proof. At dawn, Trish texted one line. "Bring that recording to court. Judge Hale wants to hear how he threatened CPS." By sunrise, Rachel was dressed like herself again. Not expensive, just steady. A navy suit from a discount rack, hair pinned clean, the twins' lunchboxes packed and labeled for the neighbor Trish had arranged to watch them. Eli tried to hand her his stuffed dinosaur for court luck, and Rachel kissed his fingers. "You stay safe here," she told them both, making her voice gentle on purpose. She would not let this fight swallow their childhood. On the subway into Manhattan, she opened Trish's checklist on her cracked iPhone. Recording saved in 3 places. HR emails printed, CPS visit notes documented, Credit Bureau fraud alert confirmation, and Owen Carlisle's metadata report attached with a clean timeline. It felt almost ridiculous. How much of her life now lived in timestamps? But that was the point. Lies floated. Proof stayed. Trish met her at the courthouse steps with a takeaway coffee and a thin folder that looked too small to hold what it carried. "No speeches," Trish said. "Short answers. Let the facts do the damage." Owen stood a few feet behind, quiet as always, carrying a sealed USB evidence envelope like it was a medical specimen. Inside, the hallway was crowded again. Families, lawyers, and strangers waiting for their own judgment. Rachel could feel eyes on her, but today she didn't shrink. She had already been humiliated. There was nothing left to take except her children, and she wasn't handing them over. Grant arrived 10 minutes late as if time obeyed him. A new suit. New confidence. And beside him, a different attorney, older, sharper, the kind of man who looked like he'd been hired to end problems. Grant didn't look at Rachel. He looked past her like she was a phase. The clerk called the case. Judge Hale entered, expression controlled. "We will address retaliation allegations first," she said, and Rachel felt her chest tighten. Trish stood and placed the recording transcript on the table. "Your Honor, Mr. Wexler threatened to influence CPS and the hospital unless Miss Monroe signed," she said. "We have the call." Grant's new attorney smiled faintly like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Your Honor," he said, "before we play anything, we have a witness who can explain Miss Monroe's pattern of instability." Rachel's pulse jumped. Instability. The old word, the old cage. Judge Hale turned to the door. "Bring the witness in," she ordered. And when the door opened, Rachel saw her own HR manager step inside and raise a hand to swear an oath. The HR manager, Linda Carver, walked to the witness stand like she'd rehearsed the distance. She avoided Rachel's eyes at first, hand raised, voice clipped as she swore to tell the truth. Grant's new attorney smiled, confident. "Ms. Carver," he began, "did Ms. Monroe's personal life create a workplace safety concern?" Linda swallowed. "No," she said, and the smile on his face stiffened. He leaned in. "You placed her on administrative leave." "Yes," Linda admitted, "because we received an anonymous complaint alleging she was unstable and bringing conflict onto hospital property." She paused, then reached into her bag and set a folder on the rail. But after this court issued the preservation order, our IT department traced the complaint's originating IP to a forwarded message sent from a Park Avenue office suite. The forwarding address matches a domain associated with Mr. Wexler's firm. A ripple moved through the benches. Grant's jaw tightened. Trish stood without theatrics. "Miss Carver," she asked, "did anyone contact you directly about Ms. Monroe's employment?" Linda's hands trembled as she opened the folder. "Yes, I received a call from Mr. Wexler," she said, voice louder now, steadier. "He said, and I quote, 'If she doesn't sign, you can't keep her around kids.' He implied donations would be affected." Linda looked at Judge Hale. "I want the record to show Ms. Monroe has an excellent performance history. The complaint was not credible." Judge Hale's eyes didn't soften, but her tone sharpened. "Mr. Wexler, sit back," she warned, before he even moved. Trish placed Rachel's recorded call transcript on counsel table. Owen Carlisle added the certified log, time, file hash, and chain of custody. "The thread is consistent with the metadata pattern we've already documented," Owen said calmly. "Retaliation attempts align with the fake exhibit timeline." Grant's attorney tried to pivot. "Your Honor, this is a family matter," but Judge Hale cut him off. "This is a court matter." Then she looked directly at Rachel. "Ms. Monroe, temporary custody remains with you. Non-retaliation orders extend to employment and third-party reporting. Mr. Wexler will maintain insurance and pay support pending full financial disclosure." Her gavel clicked once. "And evidence tampering is being referred." Rachel didn't cry. She just breathed, like someone coming up from underwater. Grant rose too fast, face flushing, and Judge Hale's voice snapped. "Sit. One more outburst and you'll be removed." Rachel stood to leave with Trish, hands empty, spine straight, until her phone lit up with a message from the neighbor watching the twins. "Rachel, Grant is downstairs right now, demanding Eli and Emma." Rachel's blood ran cold, but Trish didn't flinch. "We don't panic," she said, already dialing the courthouse officer who'd escorted them earlier. They moved fast, down the stairs, through the lobby, past the security desk. Rachel clutching the stamped order Judge Hale had just issued. Grant was there, exactly as the text warned, standing too close to the elevator like he owned the building. The neighbor held Eli and Emma behind her legs, blocking them with her body. Now the twins looked frightened, but they were quiet, taught by too many grown-up storms. Grant's voice was smooth enough to fool strangers. "I'm their father," he said to the doorman. "She's unstable. I'm here to take them." Rachel stepped forward and held the court order up where everyone could see it. "You're here to violate it," she said, voice steady. "Temporary custody is mine. Visits are scheduled. You know that." Grant's smile twitched. "You can't stop me." A courthouse officer arrived with 2 NYPD building detail officers behind him. The officer read the order once, then looked at Grant. "Sir, you've been warned in open court. Step back." Grant's face flushed. "This is a misunderstanding." "No," Trish cut in. "This is contempt." When Grant reached toward Eli, the nearest officer caught his wrist and turned him away from the children. The neighbor scooped the twins up and retreated into the lobby office with the doorman, shutting the door. Rachel didn't chase them. She stood where the kids couldn't see her, shaking. Judge Hale's clerk called Trish 10 minutes later. The judge had been notified. Grant's attempt was added to the record. The next morning, his fund placed him on leave pending investigation, and his attorney advised him to stop contacting Rachel directly. Sienna Blake's devices were forensically imaged. The district attorney's referral moved forward. Her luxury circles didn't punish her with gossip. They punished her by shutting doors she'd lied to enter. 2 months later, HR reversed Rachel's leave in writing. Linda Carver testified again, this time to clear Rachel's name. But CPS closed the case. Support payments began, and the rehab center kept Rachel's father in therapy. On a quiet Sunday, Rachel sat with Eli and Emma on the couch, a small Kindle in her lap, reading while they colored. Dr. Samuel Reed stopped by with soup for her dad and stayed to fix a loose cabinet hinge. He didn't promise miracles, he just showed up, again and again, until safety felt normal. A year later, Rachel married him in a small courthouse ceremony, the twins holding her hands, her father watching from a wheelchair, tears in his eyes. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was justice, earned, and a home rebuilt on truth. So that's how the story closed, and if you're still here with me right now, that means something in Rachel's fight touched your heart in a real way. And maybe it's because, deep down, we all know what it feels like to be cornered by fear, shame, and people who try to control the narrative. The lesson isn't be loud, it's be clear. Keep receipts, keep timelines, keep your dignity. As the Stoics taught, you can't control what others do, but you can control what you choose next. Your character, your boundaries, and your steady steps forward. Marcus Aurelius said we should meet hardship with discipline, not despair, and Rachel did exactly that. She stopped begging and started building proof, one calm decision at a time. That's healing. Not a sudden glow-up, but the quiet moment you decide you're done shrinking. If this story reminded you that truth still matters, that karma can look like consequences and court orders and doors closing on liars, then carry that with you today. And hey, if you felt something here, please share, and subscribe, because your support helps us tell more stories that restore justice, honor, and hope.